So let's check out the recording I just did in Logic. Um, so I'm not going to go over how to set a project up in Logic right now. There's plenty of videos on YouTube on how to do that. But I will show you how to get a decent drum mix using basic stock Logic plugins. Most DAWs should have some pretty decent, EQ, compressors, stuff like that. So I'll just kind of show you what you can do just to get a good drum sound. So I'm going to listen to what I have, and I'm just going to play with the faders and see if, any of the mics are popping out too much. So I'll play around with volumes and just get a decent balance between the kit. Cool. So I suggest just taking some time to play around with the volume of all your mics and just see how, when you boost one mic, how does it affect the others, right? When you boost the room mic, how does that affect the snare sound, and so on and so forth. So the next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to start panning things left and right. I always keep the kick and the snare usually in the center. I find if I pan those, the drum mix sounds pretty weird. Compared to music that you and I listen to. Usually they kick in the snare in the center. The toms, I'll pan those a little bit. Overheads, I'm going to pan those the hardest, and you'll see why. It's going to give me a big stereo image of the kit. If I have a rack and a floor, sometimes I'll pan them the same amount, just in opposite directions. And same with the overheads. I love to pan overheads all the way left and right. Some people don't like to do that. They'll go, a little less, but for now, just so you can really hear it, let's see what that sounds like. Yeah, all of a sudden the drums sound bigger. They come to life. Yeah, the room mic, since I just have a mono room mic, I'm going to leave that just centered right now. I kind of hear this with the snare in relation to the room mic. When I bring up the room, the snare sounds a little thin compared to what I thought it sounded like. So let me show you what I mean. When I take away the room mic, there's a little bit more body to the snare. It just sounds a little more full. Right? Sure, the room sounds louder, but the snare sounds a little thinner. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into utility, and I'm going to get the gain plugin. I'm going to flip the phase on the room mic. I'm not going to get all sciencey right now on what that means, but just check this out. Ready? I'm going to bring the room mic up. Okay, when I hit this button, you hear how the body of the snare comes back in? Just by flipping the phase, the relationship between the room and the snare is now more in phase than it was before. Therefore, the snare to my ear sounds better. So I'm going to leave it flipped like that. Now, if you hear that with the toms or the kick or the bottom snare mic, and I would go through, especially on the bottom snare mic, and mess around with that phase invert button. And if the sound is more full, more complete, then go with that, right? Just trust your ears. You don't want drums sounding thin and weak and papery, all right? So, but we're going to fast track this. We're going to keep going. So what I would do next is I would probably go through and see if there's any EQ adjustments I can make in order to make the drums sound punchier, a little more full, give them a little bit more weight. Just mess around with the color and the tone of everything. Now, I advise you to, when you're new to this and you're just messing around, sure, go ahead and solo each individual mic and go crazy with the EQ and just see what everything does. But just a fair warning, and I learned this the hard way with a lot of mixes, is I would go in and I would just, search for problems that weren't there. And I would just over EQ and over compress and just get a little bit overzealous with the plugins. And, if my advice is, if you don't hear a problem that you can actually identify within the context of the full mix, then it's probably not worth going through and, trying to figure out the perfect frequencies to cut on the floor tom mic or what. If you can't explain to yourself, like, hey, I hear some boxiness in the mids, or something like that, or some harshness in the upper mids on the overheads, right? If you don't have a clear idea of what you want to remove, then just be careful with it. Don't over cut on the EQ, right? Okay, so let's go through, and these are just some general things that I might do. This is not a end all be all for drum set EQ or anything like that. Also, first thing I'm noticing is I did not set my gain too well on my kick, so I might go into the gain plugin or the gain tool. Just bump that just a hair. I want the gain between all the drums and the mics to be fairly similar. I'm not going to get too deep into that right now, but if one source is just way quieter than the others, then it's going to force you to have to do more work later. But anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the stock EQ. I'm going to go through, starting at the kick, and see if there's anything that would improve the sound. So I'm just going to try not to solo a whole lot. Let's see, let's get a good chunk here. Okay. So we know we want the kick to be nice and punchy in the low end, right? That's the lowest sound on the drum set usually. So let's play around with the lows and see if we can bring out something that sounds nice and pleasant. Yeah, so you'll notice starting around like 100, you're going to get that kick drum thumpiness. Now, if I go too low, like below 50, 60, those sub frequencies are, they can be cool and very useful, but if you boost those too much, it's going to sound pretty muddy, in my opinion. Maybe around there, just a slight bump. I'm just looking for a zone that's going to give that kick that extra thump to it without just totally muddying up the tone of the drum. Okay. Cool. So I hear like a little woofiness, a little boxiness kind of in this area, like this 200 to 300 area. All right. So I might just boost that so you can hear that real quick. Oh my gosh. Sorry. Okay. That's not too bad on this kick, but I might cut just a little bit of that. That's just going to clean up that lower part of the kick for me. Okay, then I also might want to hear some of the attack of the kick beater, right? That's going to be higher up, maybe starting around 2K, going up to possibly 6K, that sort of zone. So let's see where we can get a little bit more of a slap on the kick. Yeah, so I like it around 2K. Whoa, why did it do that? Around 2K. I don't know what is going on. This is very silly. Okay. Okay, so we're just going to keep quickly moving through and EQ some of the other drums. So let's listen to the snare now. The snare, I know I'm not going to want a bunch of those low sub frequencies, so I might do, this is a high pass filter. So I'm going to bring it up until the snare sounds thin, and then I'm going to back it off after that. You hear that? We lost that body around 200. So somewhere in there should kind of get rid of that extra muddy noise that we don't need. Okay. I like to really bring out the body of a snare drum. I just find it sounds more full within a mix, and it cuts through a little bit better, especially if it's a loud guitar or vocal mix. So that body is usually going to sit anywhere from, it depends on the tuning of the drum, but it could be like the 100s all the way up to the 300s. But let's see where this one sits. So yeah, you can really hear it around 200. I might bump that a little bit. Okay, and then sometimes there can be, like I said, a boxy kind of nasally tone within each one of these drums, and you kind of have to find where that lies. It's usually like not too far above the fundamental body of each, right? So the body of this was around 200 hertz, so I'm going to listen maybe slightly above 200 and see if there's any boxiness I can eliminate. And when I'm trying to search for that boxy muddiness, I'm I want my EQ band to be fairly wide. If it's super narrow, it's gonna be harder to hear. Yeah, so around here, I feel like cutting that slightly will just warm up the snare sound overall. Cool. Also, some of that boxiness could be coming from the snare bottom mic. Okay, so always play around with your faders first to see if those help fix any issues before you go crazy with the EQ. And then sometimes, depending on the snare and the mix, I'll boost some upper mids just to give the snare an extra little bite. So let's see if we can find something that sounds pleasing. Somewhere in here, it gives the snare a little bit more bite on those rim shots. It's not bad, but just be careful with boosting it too much and having the snare sound really harsh. You don't want that either. All right, so for sake of time, I would go through and maybe check out the snare bottom mic and see if there's any issues there. Maybe cut out some of that low end as well. And same thing with the toms, right? Like, let's do the floor tom, for example. Let me find a slice of audio that has the floor. There we go. I'm just going to loop this section real quick. Cool. Cool. So same thing. There might be some low, sub frequencies that I don't want to dominate the floor tom sound once I boost, that fundamental body. So I'm going to cut. I'm not going to do a hard high pass on this though. Okay, it's just going to tighten up some of those real low frequencies. Let's see if boosting this sounds pleasant. Yeah, maybe just a slight bump. Not too much, or else it's going to sound too thumpy and weird and unnatural. That's what I found, my old drum mixes were over EQ'd, which made the drum sound unnatural. And I'm a fan of, keeping the source as natural sounding as possible for most genres, unless you're getting weird, But okay, so there's a little bit of overtone gunk in here. And I should say this as well, you see me boosting to kind of hear where those problems might be, which is, it's a fine process for hearing that stuff, but just be careful. If you boost any frequency like crazy, it's going to sound like shit. It just will, even if it's the one that you want to fill out the sound. If you boost something too much, it's going to sound like a mess. So just be careful. And then, I might try and find some of that attack up here with, the stick sound hitting the floor tom and see if there's anything that'll bring out some of that presence. Yeah, somewhere up there. So here's what I do with my overheads. I have two overheads. What I'm going to do is I'm going to group these together. I'm going to send them to a bus. Okay, if you're not familiar with buses, you're going to have to find another video to figure out what those are. But basically, the output of both of these channels is going into one channel here, which I can process both of these together. So I can EQ both of these guys at the same time. Maybe I'll have some fun with another stock EQ. Let's see. Oh, I haven't used this in a while. They got the vintage console EQ, graphic EQ, tube EQ. Let's check out the console EQ. Let's get a better loop going. Let's see. All right, cool. So this is obviously a different EQ. It's trying to replicate some sort of analog EQ. Now, this over here is our low cut, right? Our high pass filter. Any of that low gunk we don't want. With overheads, I don't really use a lot of lows, so I might cut it. We'll see. Until it sounds weird. Cool. So with overheads, I really like to nail the sparkliness of the cymbals. I want to bring out that the airy sparkliness that you get with some good quality cymbals. Now, I have pretty nice cymbals. I think they sound beautiful. So if you're using some really cheap cymbals and you start boosting the highs and the upper mids, it's going to sound harsh as hell and it's going to hurt everyone's ears, right? So just be careful with this, all right? You might not be able to boost as much as you'd like. You might even have to cut a lot of the upper frequencies that are going to just stab your ears. So, but my cymbals sound pretty tight, so let's see what this sounds like. Yeah, you could hear as soon as I got above 4 dB. In my headphones, it sounds a little harsh. Okay. Sometimes hi-hats and stuff like that can sound a little harsh around, you know, I'd say 2.5 to 4K. So yeah, that's a quick overview of overheads. I'm going to group everything together on a drum bus. So everything's going to be sent to, whoops, the overheads to go to the overhead bus first, and then to the drum bus. So, okay, so the overhead bus output is being sent to the, the drum bus. Label this overheads. Cool. So I always check if I didn't route this properly, right? If I mute this drum bus, everything should go silent. Ah, see, I messed up. Forgot the room mic. That needs to go to the drum bus. There we go. All right, so I'm going to start processing the entire kit as one thing, one instrument now. I'm not doing individual mics anymore on the drum bus. So what I might do at first is some very light compression just to kind of glue everything together. Okay, so I'm going to go in to the stock compressor, even though I have some other plugins that I would much prefer usually. But so each one of these compressors is going to have a different color to it. You can kind of go through and like listen to how the how the Platinum Digital affects the sound of the cymbals versus the Studio VCA and the Studio FET. Right, they're all gonna have a different sound. I like the FET, but I'm gonna use that later towards the end. So for now, I'll just use the Platinum Digital and just do some very light EQ. Also, I like to turn auto gain off, and I'm going to add that back in later. Okay, so for drums, I usually like to have a slower attack to let those transients punch through the compressor, right? And then it'll snap down right after that initial transient, right? So I'm going to bring this threshold way down. If all the knobs on a compressor are like totally foreign to you, there's plenty of videos on what a compressor is and how to use it on YouTube and books and stuff like that. So like I said, I'm not going to get super in the weeds here, but I'm going to bring this threshold down so that the compressor's doing a lot right now, just so you can hear the effects of it. So this is a lot of compression. I normally wouldn't do this. This is just so you can hear it. All right, so if I completely clamp down on this attack, the snare, the kick, those are not punching through. If I slow it down all the way, this is a very slow attack. All right, all of a sudden, boom, the snare cuts through a lot more. Okay, but I'm gonna bring this up. I don't want to hear a lot of this compression right now. This is just to glue everything together so when I run it through other plugins, it's not going to be, there's not going to be these harsh spikes. I'm going to have the release pretty fast, right? I don't want a medium release where you can hear like this pulsing, and I don't want it to be super slow either and just completely crush the drums. All right, with a quick release, you're going to get usually a little more punch out of that. Okay, so I'm getting like 2 to 3 dB of gain reduction, so I might give that back in the makeup gain. Cool. And then I check my meters. If I'm hitting my bus meters too hard, or I don't have enough headroom for other plugins and processing, then I'll bring the output gain down a little bit. Alright, because I don't want to be super close to redlining that output if I'm going to add some other EQ or saturation or something, right? So cool. Alright, that's sounding pretty good so far. Now, in terms of compression and EQ and saturation, I like to do all of those things on the drum bus. The order changes for me sometimes. Sometimes I'll use certain saturation to kind of reduce the dynamic range. And that also will kind of help glue everything together before I go back in and do some more EQs, right? So for now, yeah, let's do some saturation now. That way, if we hear some problems later, we can EQ after the saturation. Distortion, yeah, why not? I'll stick to stock plugins. Yeah, why not? Let's mess around with cool. All right, so I don't want to completely cut out all the highs. I'm going to roll that all the way up. Okay, and then now I'm going to drive this until I start to hear some unpleasant sounds. Ooh, yeah, that sounds way too crunchy. So there's a lot of saturation plugins out there that are much better sounding, in my opinion, than this. But I like to drive it just until I can barely hear a little bit of that distortion. Once I start hearing a lot of it, especially in the cymbals, I'm not a big fan of that, unless it's a really aggressive song or something, right? Something nasty. But if we're just trying to go for a nice, normal sounding drum set, I'm not going to drive that like crazy. There's a time and a place for it, but let's keep it moving. Okay, so basically all that's doing is just giving the overall drum sound a little bit more life, and technically it's reducing the dynamic range a little bit. So, there's a couple different ways to use saturation. I find it usually just brings the overall tones of the drums to life a little bit more. So maybe I'll do another video on some of my favorite plugins that are not stock plugins to use. But for now, we're going stock, baby. Let's see. I need to do more listening. I'm trying to rush through this. Okay, and all this stuff I'm doing with compression and EQ and saturation, you can do that on individual mics as well. Like sometimes I'll just go in and I'll crush the room mic. I'll just compress the shit out of it and just get it sounding nasty, and then just blend that in to the overall sound, right? Something like this. I'm going to use actually one of my favorite. I think this plugin's free. It's a dope plugin, but it's just got one knob for the amount of saturation and then the types. That's just the output gain. Even something silly like that can make the tone of the drum set, excuse me, way more aggressive and just punchy, and just give it like some extra juice that wasn't there before, you know? So play around with saturation on the kick, on the snare, on the rooms, right? All these different individual mics are gonna have a different result with that. So yeah, usually drum bus processing, I try and keep it fairly light with what I'm doing. If I'm gonna get crazy, I better have a reason to do that. But all right, let's see. So usually I'd listen for any issues, right? If my compressors or my saturation, if that's adding any unwanted frequencies, then I'd add another EQ and go through that and surgically remove some of that stuff. Or let's say I just want a little extra brightness out of the whole kit. All right, let's just say, okay, I like how that sounds with across the whole kit. Something like that. Or I hear some harshness after I did the clip or the distortion. You're just constantly listening and adjusting, right? You got to have a reason for adding compression or saturation or EQ. And there's not a strict process that I always do. It depends on the recording, depends on the overall goal of the mix, right? So this is just a general rough sketch of what you could do if you're a beginner or you're lost, or So then maybe I'd go and I'd do like another final just gluing the kit together and seeing what other tones I can get out of this compression. So same thing, slower attack, fast release. And I hear this distortion just cutting in a little too much. Not the biggest fan of this plugin, to be honest. It just sounds harsh. But I guess there's a time and a place for that, right? So I'm going to bring my threshold down until I start to hear it, right? Don't just rely on the meters, right? You got to trust your ears. Okay, that's way too much. Yeah, I just wanted to just lightly clamp down on it and I don't want to hear it too much. The cool thing about this Studio FET, the distortion, right? This actually sounds pretty good to me. Watch this. It's gonna add some gain, some volume. So maybe you have to do less makeup gain with that, but just depends on how hard you want to crush the dynamic range. They also have a cool built-in limiter, which a lot of compressors do, especially like Mixbus compressor plugins. You should have like a limiter setting, and this, I only want the limiter to be working for like the highest peaks to avoid any clipping on the bus. kind of shave off and control the top end of those dynamic punches. You know, my overheads feel a little bit dominant in this mix. Maybe I'll turn some of this down a little bit. And then I'll just turn the fader down. Okay, so you're always just making tweaks, adjustments as you go. Last thing I might do is either some, a limiter plugin that I like, or I'm not sure if Logic has a free built-in clipper. Maybe this clip distortion, but basically I have this free plugin from Ven Audio. This plugin's great because all you're doing is just shaving off the top end of each like loud transient, right? So later, if you're trying to drive this mix into a limiter and trying to get a lot of volume out of it, this will allow for a little bit more headroom with some of those transients. So I could see kind of where the transients are here in relation to where the threshold is. And you'll see down here, if I start clipping those transients really hard, you'll see it'll turn red. And it just sounds, super distorted and crushed. But that's not my goal for now. Just want to shave off a little bit. Maybe give it a little makeup gain, but cool. The only other thing I might do with this is, because I recorded this in a small room, I'm going to send pretty much the whole kit to another bus. Oops. For some verb, some bigger room sounds. I don't like to send a lot of kick. I send mostly the other shells though, the snare and the toms. Okay, let's see, reverb. I really like this Space Designer because it sounds the most real to me. I'm going to have this all the way wet, and I'm going to play with how much signal I send and just the master volume on this bus as well. All right, so right out the gate, that sounds a little too big for my liking. That's what she said. Okay, so it sounds like it's in a giant room right now. I'm not a fan of that, so I'm going to bring down the size here. Pre-delay, just delaying the attack essentially of that verb, like when you're hearing it. So the initial snare hits are going to pop through more. All right, if I crank this, it's going to show up way later. It could be a cool, fun effect, but it sounds kind of silly. So my goal with this is as natural as possible. So you have to know what a drum set in a big room sounds like, I guess, to be able to hear that. Okay, it's also kind of loud. Now I'm going to EQ the actual verb on it. I don't like a lot of lows or a lot of highs in the verb. It just sounds too splashy and distracting. So I'm going to cut out a lot of lows. And then let's cut out a lot of these highs too. I cut sometimes like all the way down to like 2K. Okay, so, you can play around with the length of the verb. But really, when it comes to reverb and room sound, you just have to sit there and play with it for a while. It can be kind of tricky if the room you're working in is like really small and dry and you're trying to make it sound massive. It can take some fine tuning and some EQing and some compressing and stuff like that. So, all right, this video is getting pretty long, so this is just a rough beginner's guide to a somewhat decent drum mix, right, when it comes to EQ and compression. So I might make a part 2 on some more advanced techniques that I like to use to get this just sounding even more aggressive and just more colorful, right? At the end of the day, I like to have my tones be very rich and colorful and warm, right? So a lot of these stock plugins are great, but it's hard to achieve some like really high quality sounds with just stock plugins, right? But that's okay. Sometimes raw and simple is the way to go. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching and listening, and stay tuned for more content.